विज्ञान की अनकही कहानियाँ। आइए हम सुने विज्ञान की अनसुनी कहानियाँ।
Hello listeners, you're listening to Vigyan Ki Awaaz podcast program on STEM popularization, catalyzed and supported by the Ministry of Science and Technology, Government of India and Media for Community Foundation. Project devised and designed by Dr. R. Sridhar and assisted by Ashish Tiwari. Local coordination and production, Professor Subramanian. Content writing by Priyanshu and post-production by Professor Kaushik P. Kanchan of Garden City University, Bengaluru.
Garden City University, conquer we shall all adversity. Together we stand in unity. Together we strive for prosperity. GCU, emphasis on life. GCU, emphasis on life.
On today's episode, we have Professor Amitabh Joshi, a leading evolutionary biologist specializing in adaptation to extreme crowding and competitive evolution. His research integrates experimental and theoretical approaches to explore life history evolution, competition dynamics, and population ecology, offering key insights into evolutionary processes and ecological interactions.
Okay, so I am basically an evolutionary biologist, and I work in multiple areas of evolutionary biology as well as population ecology. So our work covers mostly 3-4 different sub-areas. We work on how organisms adapt to extreme crowding that is experienced generation after generation, what sort of ways in which they evolve to become more competitive. We also study what is called life history evolution. By life history, we mean the duration of the juvenile phase, how long it takes to become adult, what kind of fecundity schedule or reproductive output you have once you become reproductively mature, and how long your life is or your longevity. So all these things together are referred to as the life history. And the life history is very important in evolution because it is through the life history that any adaptation must exert its effects in order to reflect in higher Darwinian fitness or higher lifetime offspring production. So we also work a lot on the evolution of developmental rates, evolution of rates of aging, evolution of fecundity schedules, etc. Finally, in collaboration with one of my colleagues here and 2 of our former students from our department who are now faculty in IISER Pune and IISER Mohali, so the 4 of us, myself, Professor T.N.C. Vidya, Professor N.G. Prasad and Professor Sutirth Dey, have this group called the Foundations of Genetics and Evolution Group, within which we re-examine the core conceptualizations at the heart of evolutionary biology, such as how do we understand and define Darwinian fitness? Can we reconceptualize natural selection in a more useful way to incorporate heredity in it and things like that? So this particular work actually is among the only non-Western contributions to core conceptual developments in evolutionary biology which is going on in the field right now for last 20 years. And finally, in population ecology, I am interested in doing work on so-called meta-populations. These are a number of small populations that are not entirely independent of each other. There is some amount of movement between them, but they are sufficiently independent and inhabit slightly different habitats so that one can talk about the local population dynamics of how the number of individuals in the population grows or falls, as well as the global dynamics of the entire ensemble. And this is again an area which is very interesting because the impact of different rates of movement between these partially isolated populations has some very counterintuitive effects on the stability of the entire system. So these are broadly the 4 areas we work on.
Professor Joshi explained to us how his research is going to help India in the short term and long term.
Right. So when we talk about how any piece of research helps the country, that can be looked at in many different ways, partly depending upon what is the nature of the research. For applied research, the question is easier to answer. You can say, okay, I'm trying to find a drug for some particular disease for which they are not very effective drugs, or I'm trying to develop a new device to make certain kind of measurements, etc. That is an immediate impact or immediate feedback on society. For people like me who do basic research, the connections to tangible applied benefits are much longer, possibly in the future. For example, I mentioned the work we do on understanding the interaction of local population dynamics with the rates of movement across populations and how it can affect the stability or instability of the entire set of populations. This is an area of work we may be doing it with the intention of understanding some fundamental question in ecology or population ecology, but it has implications for how we do conservation management, for example. It has implications in how we construct corridors to connect isolated populations. If you end up inducing too much of migration with your corridor, you can actually collapse the entire system. So it has some implications there. When it comes to evolution more broadly, I think fundamental research in evolution affects many things. It's a very common misconception that many people have, even within biology, that evolution doesn't have much of applied significance, but actually that's not so. If we look at any of the major problems that we face as a society that have some biological element to it, so I'm not talking about purely economic or purely social problems, but for example, diseases, zoonotic diseases. To understand the spread of a zoonotic disease like we experienced with COVID, to plan a proper vaccination schedule and strategy for a nation. See, devising a vaccine against a new disease, that may be the job of an immunologist or a biomedical scientist. They have to come up with the vaccine. But how you are going to deploy the vaccine? Supposing you have limitation, you can't vaccinate everybody in one shot. We don't have enough copy of the vaccine. How do you prioritize which age group you will vaccinate more with priority? Which areas of the country? Do you want maximum coverage in one area or lesser coverage across? All of these questions to address in epidemiology, you need a grounding in evolutionary biology. Without that, you can't. These are not questions which the person who can make the vaccine, they will not be trained to address this set of questions. In fact, one of the things you realize we observed during COVID few years back is that India lacks good epidemiologists. And the reason we lack good epidemiologists is because we don't pay enough attention to training people in evolution. We don't have any postgraduate department of evolutionary biology. In fact, our department where we are sitting right now is the only department in the entire country that has the term evolutionary biology in its name. So, similarly, if you think about how novel diseases arise, pathogens shift from some animal to humans. Some years ago, before COVID, you remember there was an outbreak of Nipah virus in Kerala. The virus has switched from the fruit-eating bats to the humans. And it later became clear by further studies that this shift is partly happening as a result of climate change because the range of the bat is getting restricted, it is moving towards human settlements. So understanding this dynamics of how anthropogenic change can cause or facilitate the arising of novel diseases, this again requires an evolutionary biology background. These problems require a very thorough ecological and evolutionary understanding of what is happening. And there are many such examples where there are applications of evolution. Now, another way of looking at how it benefits the nation, is in terms of contributions to global knowledge, historically in ancient times, and then of course during the colonial period, our contributions for some time went down and then began to come up again. After all, C.V. Raman and S.N. Bose and others were active while we were still under British colonial rule. But if you look in terms of contributing to knowledge, then our work can play a great role. And that is the case in India with evolutionary biology. Evolution is a relatively neglected field in India in terms of representation in the curriculum, or people don't think of evolution as a research field. But if you look at the contribution of Indian biologists to creation of new knowledge, new understanding, our small evolution and ecology and animal behavior community has made very solid contributions. In fact, we have made far more contributions to the growth of fundamental knowledge than the molecular biology community has. But unfortunately, in the media and in the public awareness, molecular biology is all you ever hear about. But I used to get asked this question often in Delhi at these sort of high-powered, planning committees and all. They say, where are the world leaders in Indian biology? And I always used to say to them, you're looking in the wrong place. You're looking at Indian molecular biology. Yes, there are no particular world leaders there. But if you look at ecology and evolution, there are. And I'll give you a very small example. In 2019, a book was published in a very prestigious series from Elsevier that is called Conceptual Advances in Evolutionary Ecology. So this is like a series on different topics, conceptual advances. So to catch some very distinguished senior researcher in the field internationally and ask them to write what they think in the last 100-200 years are the great conceptual advances in their field. So this book came out in 2019 on evolutionary ecology, and it lists 65 studies, starting with Charles Darwin's book on the origin of species published in 1859 till about the year 2010. Of those 65 studies that this very distinguished evolutionary biologist from University of California at Irvine regards as the 65 breakthroughs, one of them is research published from our lab in JNCSR. And this is the only non-Western research contribution in that book. Now, when something like this happens, I feel even this can be interpreted as doing something for the image of the country. It may not be directly affecting the society in a tangible way.
He also rated the research and development scenario in India, especially in science and technology.
I obviously cannot comment on other disciplines with which I will not be familiar what is the exact status of research. I mean, I do believe we do very well in certain areas of physics and material science in particular. But evolutionary biology and animal behavior, actually in the last 40 years, India has been doing very well. The community has also grown. When I joined in 1996 as a young faculty member, there were maybe 5 or 6 good research groups in this whole area in the whole country. Today there are about 35-40 groups who are doing good research. I'm not talking about those who are doing average research. So in many areas, for example, again, as I mentioned, see, we always hear about biomedical related research and molecular biology. Imagine tomorrow there's a headline in the newspaper that says more than 50% of all the research groups in the world doing cancer research are in India. Can you imagine how we would all feel about it? We'll be like, my God, more than half the cancer research is done in India. In my field, experimental evolution, that is a reality. More than 50% of all the labs in the world that do long-term experimental evolution studies addressing fundamental questions in evolution are actually in India. But because it doesn't concern biomedical application, nobody hears about it. In one particular area, that is the adaptations to crowding that I mentioned earlier, for the last 15 to 20 years, our research group, our lab here at JNC, is the world leader in this area. We are the most active. In another area, for example, there used to be a question of why are populations in nature stable? That is, their numbers don't fluctuate very much. For some species they do, but many species are more stable. And theoretically, one would expect it to be more common for populations to be unstable, to undergo large fluctuations in their numbers. So the question has always been, what are the ecological factors that can immediately promote stability, plus what are the evolutionary factors that may promote the evolution of population stability. And in this area, we have contributed in the past to pointing out mechanisms for the ecological stabilization of population. And when it comes to evidence for the evolution of population stability, since the year 2000, the first such study was published. There have been totally 7 studies in the world, 6 of them are from our lab. So we are leading in these fields. So at least in ecology, evolution, behavior, when it comes to the evolution of social behavior, like honeybees or wasps and such social insects, Professor Gadakkar at the Indian Institute of Science, he's world-renowned leader in that field. And there are many others, who in their respective fields are considered within the top 3, 4, 5 scientists in that sub-area. So evolutionary biology and ecology in India definitely have a very good international standing. And we are right up there competing with the best in the world. There's no doubt about it.
Professor Joshi also shared an unforgettable incident from his research journey.
Well, there are many unforgettable incidents. Most of them, as a scientist, consist of finally solving a mystery that had bothered you for a long time. So, one of the things that happened is when I was a PhD student and a postdoc abroad, I had at that time also been working on adaptation to crowding. And we had changed the thinking in the field, and the new idea that had emerged was that when insects are exposed to chronic crowding, they evolve to become faster feeders. And this at that time had challenged the paradigm then. So there was a paradigm shift, and this view developed that the primary attribute that will evolve will be to eat faster. And then almost by accident, we discovered in our lab about 22 years back that actually when we did crowding experiments here in Bangalore, the flies evolved to become faster, more competitive, but they did not become faster feeders. So initially we thought maybe we have made a mistake. We repeat the experiment. No, it's not a mistake. It's really that they have become more competitive, but without evolving the faster feeding rates. Then it took almost another 10 years to figure out what is going on. And as a result, we were able to once again bring about a paradigm shift in our understanding of how we even conceptualize the impact of density as to whether density is a good index of all the effects of crowding or not. So completely changed the field, and this was deeply satisfying, even though our later work destroyed my earlier conclusions. But as a scientist, that is something that is very, very, very good, because now you say, okay, we have a much better, much more nuanced understanding. And in the process, we had to rethink how we conceptualize the effects of crowding. It turned out that simple density, that how many flies you have in a bottle or a vial, is not a good index of crowding. It's much more subtle than that. And so we ended up sort of refining the paradigm for the second time, which I think is a great boon as a scientist to have a chance to do 2 paradigm shifting works over a period of 35 years. And we destroyed our own earlier understanding. But science is the one activity in which it's actually an advance to destroy your own previous work. This is one of the beauty of science.
Then he went on to say that in the era of AI and advanced technology, what are the ethical considerations that any researcher and student should keep in mind?
See, I think science itself ultimately is a very, very ethical venture, because everything in science runs on trust. If I have a PhD scholar doing experiments in my lab and they do the experiment, they bring me the data. I am trusting their data, right? I am not sitting over their shoulder seeing whether they are doing the experiment or not. Otherwise, if I have to do that, I can do it myself. So everything runs on trust in science, and that is very, very important. And the other thing is, I think that what all scientists should appreciate, that our ultimate allegiance and also our ultimate responsibility or obligation to is not to our lab, our department, our institution, our state, our nation. It is to the integrity and advancement of scientific understanding. That, I think, is very important for any scientist to understand. That is our primary obligation, not to departments and even nations. In many ways, see, science is a human activity. It transcends the nation. After all, see, we are all sitting with all electronic gadgets. In which of all countries of the world these researches would have been done that today we are using a smartphone. But we are all benefiting from it. All this research was not done only by Indian scientists, certainly. So science is also in some ways transnational. And we have to remember that our allegiance is to the integrity and advancement of scientific understanding. In fact, in India, it is particularly important for us to remember this, because we are the only country in the world whose constitution exhorts us to cultivate the scientific temper. This is a unique thing about Indian constitution, And I think as scientists, we should be very cognizant of it, so that we can bring rationality also into our day-to-day life, not just when we are doing science.
You were listening to Vigyan Ki Awaaz, a podcast on STEM popularization, catalyzed and supported by National Council for Science and Technology Communication, Government of India. Tune in for more such episodes to Vigyan Ki Awaaz on this platform and also through Spotify, YouTube and Apple Music platforms.
आइए हम सुने विज्ञान